un buon 있으십니까?
C'è qualcuno là fuori? C'è qualcuno là fuori? Benvenuti al Christian Podcast.
어서 오세요. 이 세상에서 마지막 라디오.
That's right, my friends. Welcome to season number 2 of Christian Podcast. We're live from Costa Mesa, California. Maybe not when you're listening. My name is Beto Gudiño, and I am El Comunicador. Yes, sir. So, I'm Beto Gudiño, and today we have an awesome topic that I want you guys to listen to this episode. We're going to get to it. We're probably going to start with the story of our guest today, and then we're going to move on towards the end of the episode to more of the detailed questions about the topic of adoption. So we have an expert today named Josh Harrison. He's my friend. He lives here in Costa Mesa. We are broadcasting live right now from one of our favorite coffee shops, right? And if you're watching us, we are cheering right now with our coffee in hand. All right, so I met you, Josh, kind of recently, but I knew about you from an old church I used to go to called Rock Harbor here in Costa Mesa. And I mean, I kind of knew about your story back then.
Sure.
Because you would preach, you would come on stage and, teach the Bible. And, at some point you mentioned that you were thinking about adopting kids. Mm-hmm. And then eventually, the story came, fulfilled with now we have children who were adopted. And this was, I don't know, a few years back. You'll probably elaborate a little more on that.
Sure.
But here's the thing. I want to talk about a little bit about your story and what's the heart of adoption when it comes to the Bible, when it comes to God. And, I was even thinking about this thing where Jesus says, I won't leave you as orphans. Right? So there's a lot of adoption in the Bible is just like throughout.
Yeah.
Right? And I want to bring that, like, what does that look like today? And I mean, I say you're an expert because you have 3 kids who were adopted. And as I was looking online on where, on Google, I was typing a few questions like how do people go about this? Like, what is the first question that people think of when it comes to adopting or deciding to adopt? Like, some of the questions that I found, I'm like, wow. This is so interesting because they were like super plain and simple. Like, can I adopt a kid from Africa?
Sure.
Can I adopt a kid from Latin America?
Yeah.
How much does it cost to adopt? Right? And of course, there's many more questions that we can tackle today. But Josh, first, why don't we talk about a little bit about your story, like who you are?
Yeah.
What's your heart for your heart? Because I know you're a pastor. So what's your heart for people?
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about you.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be on the show today. So Beto said my name is Josh. I'm pastor here in Costa Mesa of a church called Canopy that meets like a mile away from where we're sitting right now, which is awesome. I am married to my wife, Heather. We've been married for 22 years. We have 3 kids, all adopted. So we have an 18-year-old who's in college now. It's a freshman in college, which is kind of freaking me out, but she's doing well. I've got a junior in high school, and then I've got a 7-year-old little boy. So 2 girls and a boy. I have been living in this community for the better part of 25 years now here in Costa Mesa. Wow. And pastoring in this community for, 15, let's call it, something like that.
Nice.
Yeah. And no, I just love, I love the city we get to live in. I love I love a lot of the opportunities that God puts in front of his church here in this area. It's a really unique kind of context. As far as like people, I just think, a friend of mine says the meaning of life is relationship. and I think he's onto something there. Obviously, all stemming from our relationship.
like that.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
All stemming from our relationship with God, but then also just our relationships with one another. And so I love just being in a relationship with people, getting to walk alongside them. I don't mentor people or disciple people. I just walk with people, and people walk with me, and we grow together, and that's what I love about being a pastor.
Love it.
Yeah,
Love
man.
it. Well, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think, I'm just going to start with a kind of funny story, and I told you this before.
Yeah.
But I came from, here in the U.S., because I've been in so many churches because I grew up in Mexico.
Yep.
For the first 24 years of my life. And then I came here, and I started going to a Hispanic church for the most part of like my early U.S. years. And eventually we ended up going to Rock Harbor, where you were one of the teaching pastors. And I remember my mom, she kind of grew up in her faith in this other Hispanic church.
Yeah.
And to her, she just had a really, really hard time like moving to a different church.
yeah,
right? And for us to move, she was like almost to the point of like saying, you guys are in sin, you know? I mean, that's sinful to move. I don't know. Maybe some people could be right about that. But I remember, we brought her to one of the meetings at, back in the days, Rock Harbor, and you were teaching. And I remember she was like paying attention to your teaching, and at the end she almost like gave an assessment of your teaching.
All right.
Right? So a rating.
Okay.
So if we could rate with emojis, she gave you a divine emoji, right? Like she's like, but with a little bit of a skeptical emoji.
Okay, fair enough.
Because she was like, right? She was like, I think he's a godly man. But there's still something funky about being in this other place.
Fair
right?
enough. Yeah, that's it. I mean, I'll take it. Yeah, I'll take it. Take what I can get. Your mom sounds like a wise woman.
Yeah, she is, for sure. Man, I had to think about that. But no, Mom, I love you. You are so smart, and I'm your son. So I love you. Okay, so tell us a little bit about, before we go into the topic of today, like what's your... How do you become a pastor? Like, you could summarize it. I know a story is going to be probably super long.
Yeah.
But how can you summarize the heart of this is what I want to do in life versus whatever else you could do?
Yeah, I'll give you the very quick version. So when I was a kid, grew up in the church, and I felt like from an early age I had people telling me, hey, you should be a pastor. I feel like, Christians use this language of calling. God has a calling on your life. And as I started growing up a little bit, high school, college, thinking about my vocation, I just didn't have any interest. It wasn't that like I was afraid of it. Some people talk about running away from ministry. I just wasn't interested. I'd been around the church. I liked the church, but it just felt like, dealing with people all day long, dealing with problems and, the life of the church and the politics and all that just wasn't of interest to me. And then, honestly, God just kind of used a bunch of circumstances to change my mind about it. I had graduated from college with a degree in English. I thought I wanted to go into teaching at a college level. And while I was kind of spinning my wheels waiting to go to grad school, I happened to be working at on a college campus, and I had free tuition. So I just started randomly taking classes for fun, and I stumbled into a Hebrew class that I thought would be really fun, and it turned out to be really fun, and ended up kind of leading me down this road of biblical studies and scholarship, and then ended up getting involved in some missional opportunities that got me walking one-on-one with students, discipling students. And before I knew it, like I was kind of, as a result of those opportunities, was offered a job kind of discipling students through short-term missions. And it turned out to be like a vocational ministry job. I didn't realize it at the time, but I stepped into this ministry job where I was hanging out with people on a daily basis. I was, prepping and preaching sermons. I was, oh goodness, I just hit the microphone. Sorry about that.
We good, man.
All right. Sending people out on short-term mission, debriefing, all this stuff, and within a week of being on the job, I was like, this is incredible. Like, this is what I feel like I was made to do. And I came to realize it was just pastoring. Like, it wasn't in a church context at the time like it is now, but I had this sense of like, this is what I want to do with my life, I just get to have meaningful conversations with people about what God's doing in their life, teach the Word of God, pray for them, empower and equip them into mission in their daily lives. And that's what I get to do.
So how are you doing so far? Are you still enjoying that?
Oh man,
do you wish you could change a few things, or?
No, it's been an interesting season to be a pastor. With COVID, with a lot of political stuff, with racial stuff, and I'm leading a church plant, so that brings its own set of challenges because I don't get to just pastor. I also have to be like a graphic designer and an accountant and all sorts of other things to help keep a small church running. And I had some moments, if I'm being honest, I had a couple moments in the last year or so where I wasn't ready to walk away, but I understood why pastors do. It was hard, like this really hard season in the life of the church where you have people leaving all the time, upset about, you said this and it upset me, or you didn't say this and it upset me. And, with the COVID stuff, this made me mad. And it was just like, and then on top of it all, we're all remote, we couldn't even see people in person. So like that face-to-face relational element was just gone. And like I said, I never was ready to walk away. Like I still love what I do. I still feel called to it, as hard as it can be sometimes. But I get why pastors burn out. Like I totally do.
Wow, that's so good. And maybe at some other point we can talk about burning out. That would be the burning out episode. I've been reading this book, just kind of like in the parentheses.
Yeah. I
don't know if you read it, called The Way of the Lamb, The Way of the Dragon.
Yeah. Jamie Goggins.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a little bit about, we could derail right here.
Sure.
Not going to talk about it, but very interesting about the work pastors do, and then how it can get into burnout and whatnot.
Yep.
And many other things. But that'll be another episode, because this one we want to talk about adoption. And I guess what got me interested in the topic is that you were like the first person that I've ever heard of. And I feel like I had a relationship with you. It's kind of weird because you were the pastor, and in a mega church, you don't get to talk to a pastor that much.
Yeah, that's a bummer.
That's a bummer. But at the same time, on my end, I feel like I did know you.
Sure. Yeah, you hear my story a lot. Yeah. I know who you were too, by the way.
You did?
Oh yeah, I heard about you. I heard about this guy Beto all the time.
Okay, good things, I bet.
Always.
Okay, so I kind of knew your story, and it impacted me when one day you brought your kids on the stage. And you said, it's finally realized, like, we adopted. These are our kids. We're going to love on them. So there's a lot of questions that I kind of have, and I think I have a heart for people that have a heart for adoption.
Sure.
And I want this episode to kind of like resolve some of their main questions.
Yeah.
Right? So today I want to talk about, like, what is helpful to ask, what is unhelpful to ask.
Yeah, that's great.
What are some of the taboos when it comes to adopting? Are there any statistics about adoption?
Sure.
What is the heart of God when it comes to adoption? So all these questions that I have in my mind, and I guess the first one would be along these lines, like, what does the easier one is, what does the Bible say about adoption?
Oh gosh. Yeah, this is what led my wife and I into adoption in the first place, was really considering what the Bible said. I had a friend who challenged me to think through that very question. He was the first person I'd met in my life who was adopting as his first choice. I know there are other people who've done it, but the first person I met, most people that I had known prior to that came to adoption through infertility or some other means, which I'm a big advocate of adoption however people get there, whether it's their plan A or their plan Z, But this was the first guy I met that said, this is our plan A. And I just kind of asked why, like, what's the deal with that? And he said, essentially the question you asked me, well, have you ever read what the Bible says about adoption? And I couldn't say that I had. And so he led me through some stuff, and I did some of my own research, and I found that, like, adoption, the adoption language is a big deal in the New Testament, which we'll talk about in a second, but the idea of caring for the vulnerable is everywhere in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. It's funny, in this last couple of years, this word justice has come up a lot in the church in different contexts. And sometimes, depending on the tradition of church you're from, it's negative or positive depending on what you're looking at. And I get frustrated with that, because the Old Testament talks about justice on almost every page. And justice in the Old Testament is caring for the vulnerable. And the Old Testament has this specific understanding of what the vulnerable looks like. It's for them, it's widows, orphans, which the Old Testament calls fatherless, immigrants, and the poor. So strangers, foreigners, and the poor. And you look at that and you just kind of say, okay, fatherless is one of the main categories that the Old Testament seems to, that the law, the Torah, says we should care for. Then you get into like the prophets, and the prophets are like ripping into Israel because they didn't do it. And you see that like God cares a great deal about this. You know, some of the passages that for me were the most enlightening were, you know, there's this passage in, I'm going to get my references all wrong, but I think in Jeremiah, where Jeremiah's talking about this king, you know, King Josiah. You getting this right?
I think so, man. Come on,
yeah.
Bible scholars.
Yeah, anyway, yeah. I'm going to quote Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and I always get them reversed in my mind, but I think Jeremiah is the one who talks about Josiah, and he's basically, you know, Josiah is this famous king. He became king when he was a little kid. When he was 18, discovered a scroll of God in the temple and realized that they weren't living up to the Torah, so he tears his clothes, declares a like national revival, like changes the whole country, all this sort of stuff. And he's often commended as like this hero for that. But Jeremiah, I think the prophet asked the question. I'll butcher the exact quote, but basically he's saying like, what did Josiah do right? You know, and the answer comes back from the Lord. Good King Josiah, he defended the cause of the poor and the needy. Is this not what it means to know me? That line right there just crushes me. Is this not what it means to know me? Says the Lord. Defend the cause of the poor and the needy. And when you have that the Old Testament context, that means, like I said, widows, orphans, immigrants primarily, and vulnerable. And so that's what Josiah did right. I mean, he had this national revival. He, you know, tore down idols. He did all this great stuff. But at the end of the day, what the answer comes back from God is he was just. He cared for the vulnerable. And then you go to Ezekiel, and Ezekiel's talking about Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom specifically on the other side, which we know Sodom is famous for its sexual sin and getting burned down with fire and brimstone. And the prophet there is asking the question, like, what did they do wrong? You know? And God's answer is they were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. It doesn't say anything about sexual sin there, although that was a real thing. Arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not care for the poor and the needy.
Wow.
That's what God judges Sodom for. It's not just the sex stuff that we all like to talk about as Christians, but they didn't care for the vulnerable. And so you look at that and you're like, okay, obviously God cares about this a great deal. So much so that in my mind, as I read the Old Testament, I was told as a kid that idolatry is the sin that God hates the most. And that he will over and over again threaten to like withdraw his presence from his people on the basis of their idolatry. But we see the same thing is true of injustice. That those two things go together in the mind of God.
Idolatry and injustice.
And those are the two things that, to my knowledge, somebody might correct me, are the only two things in the Old Testament where God says, I don't want to hear you. I'm going to withdraw my blessing and my presence because you're not doing these things. And one of them is caring for the vulnerable, which in our world and in their world definitely involved orphans, fatherless, as a massive component. And then you get to the New Testament and that picture just gets like amplified. It just gets enlarged like massively. I mean, the famous verse in James where James says, religion that God our Father considers as pure and faultless is this, to care for widows and orphans in their distress and to keep oneself from being corrupted by the world. That's famous. But if you start looking at, like you said, you referenced Paul in the book of Romans, or Jesus in the book of John, I won't leave you as orphans, I will come to you. Like this adoption language is the language that God actually uses to communicate what he's done for us. And so it's not just, it's really fascinating. And we found this to be true in our own experience, that adoption is both the outworking of the gospel. Like if you have received the gospel, this is something you step into. You care for the vulnerable, you care for the poor, you care for the orphan. But it's also like a way into the gospel. It's a way of understanding the gospel and what God has done for us. And that's what we found to be true. And this is probably answering another question. But like when Jesus says, I won't leave you as orphans, I will come to you, the process of adopting for us has made that more real in our lives. You know what I mean? Or when Paul says, the spirit you've received doesn't make you slaves so you live in fear again, but rather the spirit you've received has brought about your adoption to sonship. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. Like that happens in my house. An adopted son calling me dad. You know? And that just makes the gospel so alive. So it's this really like, it's because we've received the gospel, we live this out. And because we live it out, we receive the gospel more and more. So it's, I mean, you can't possibly overstate the importance of adoption in the biblical story, for sure.
Wow, that's amazing, man. As you're talking, what's coming to my mind is, so like the other day I had an episode with a philosopher, a professor of philosophy, and we were talking about like why do people don't believe in God? And one of the reasons is like, well, some people don't believe in God because they cannot understand that God could be good, right? So there's this thing called the problem of evil,
right? And
I feel like, in a sense, what you're talking about, when God defends the cause of the poor and the needy and the vulnerable, it's almost like, okay, let's move on from the problem of evil. It's there, but this solves or this answers the question: is God good? At least in my case, I feel like this makes sense.
Yeah,
is God good? Well, He is good, and He's going to showcase His goodness through people who care for the needy and the vulnerable.
Well, that's the crazy part, is the Bible calls, in the Old Testament, literally calls God the Father to the fatherless. It says he clothes he feeds the hungry, He clothes the naked, He cares for the vulnerable. And you ask the question, like, how does He do that, And it's clear that the way He does it is through His people. Like, that's His plan A to work in the world, is to work through people. And so when He calls Himself the Father to the fatherless, what He's saying is, I have chosen this population as my own. I have placed my special protection over them, and therefore, if you are one of my people, they are now under your special protection as well. That's what it means to be the people of God. That's why God has a people, so that they can reflect His priorities. And one thing that we see without fail over and over again, from the beginning of the Bible to the very end, is that one of God's priorities is the fatherless. And if we're His people, then they are under our protection as well.
Wow. I love it. Man, that is just so helpful. I feel like that's kind of like solves the where can we see the heart of adoption in the Bible, and it's really the heart of God, and it's the call to His people to live out His goodness. Right. So that's so cool, man. So let's talk about a little bit of the nitty and gritty. Like, how did that end up happening for you? Like, what were some of the first questions that you were asking when you decided to adopt? And also, the fact that you, like you were saying, it was your first choice. Like, you could have had kids, but you decided not to, and you decided to adopt. Like, how did you end up like deciding yes?
Like I said, this friend of mine was the first person that I'd ever heard that kind of language from, and it intrigued me. And my wife and I were fairly young, married at the time. We were 26, 27, hadn't had biological kids yet, hadn't really tried to. And I was intrigued by that idea. I didn't really talk to my wife about it because I was also a little bit scared. And then, you know what it was? It was he challenged me to read the Bible and see what the Bible said, and I did. I read through it. I studied. I listened to different people talk about what the Bible says about adoption. But it really caught fire in our lives when we kind of saw some of the need firsthand. So my wife and I got a chance through the ministry job I was telling you about before to lead a team of students to an orphanage in Africa, which was just a kind of a game-changing experience for us to see what, obviously we could have seen it here as well. We just didn't have eyes to see it. But to go to that context and see what fatherlessness and what it means to be a vulnerable child with no rights, no protections in the world. And while we were both there, God kind of spoke independently to each of us. And one night, I remember we were chatting, kind of debriefing the day, and my wife just said, I don't feel like we can leave these kids. And that's where I kind of said, I've been, it's weird that you say that. Like, I've been thinking the same kind of thing for the last year and haven't really known how to talk about it. But maybe we shouldn't leave them, I didn't mean stay in Africa, although whatever God wants to do, but I meant maybe caring for the fatherless is for us. And the more we prayed about it, the more clearly we heard God say, I want this to be your plan A. I want this to be how you build your family. Specifically, the wording that came to our hearts was, we want your home to be a place where orphans become sons and daughters. And so that's how we built our family.
Wow, that's incredible. And when you say what are some of the taboos when it comes to thinking about adoption? You mentioned the word, I was a little scary. What was scary about even thinking about it or committing to a decision? What are some of the things you think people go through?
I think there's all sorts of different ideas. First of all, it's not the most common way of building a family, which is something I would love to see change more and more as more people step into it. And it has changed, actually, even in the last decade, a little bit. But I think people, for the most part, understand the notion of having a biological child. Like, they get that the process in which you go through and all that sort of stuff. Like, even if you haven't done it, you get the idea of, like, doctor's visits and Lamaze classes and, on and on and on. With adoption, I don't think most people understand how the process works, or even the ways, there are different ways you can adopt. And so there's a little bit of, like, the fear of the unknown. And then there's also a stigma with it. Like, I think, well, several stigmas. I mean, I think one of them is that it's like it's only a plan B option. Like, the only reason anybody would ever possibly do it is if you couldn't have a kid another way. And like I said, I don't care how people arrive at adoption. So I'm an advocate of people who've, tried to have a child biologically, not able to. I'm an advocate of adoption, no matter how you get there. But I think one of the things I want to shift in my ministry and my life is helping people understand it doesn't have to be your plan B or C or whatever else. It can be a plan A. If you read the Bible clearly, I think for more Christians, it should be a plan A. So helping to take away that plan A or plan B mentality also helps to take away the stigma of somehow it's a less than experience. Because if you think about it, if adoption is only a plan B, then that means it's second best. Like, I always want to try this first.
Yeah.
And if this doesn't work, I'm super disappointed, then I'll go to this as like my backup plan. And when you have that second best mentality, then it just creates all sorts of problems. Because you have classically you have stories, of parents who hide adoption from their kids because they don't want their kids to feel second best. Like it's something to be ashamed of. We shouldn't talk about this in front of the kids. We don't want them to know they're adopted. Or, you have people coming up and asking questions like, which I did when I was before we adopted too, like, oh, you guys adopted. That's so nice. Couldn't you have your own kids? That kind of like, this must be some sort of less than experience. What's fascinating is I won't get into this too deeply, but when the Bible talks about adoption, when Paul talks about adoption in Romans 8, or Jesus talks about it in John 14, that's not the understanding at all. The understanding of adoption in the Roman world was not that it was second best experience, but that it was actually in some ways more significant than a biological child. And I won't get into the weeds of that, but I think that's the biggest thing. I think people think that, like, you're settling, like you only adopt if you have to. It's like oh, I'm so sorry you had to go about that way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think there is also like a very real, like, if you step into it, I don't even know how it would work. Like, and then depending on how you go, we can talk more about this if you want to, but there's traditionally 3 ways to adopt. There's kind of domestic private adoption, so from within the U.S. private adoption. There's international private adoption, and then there's foster, like adopting through foster care. And each of them has its own unique challenges that are pretty daunting, pretty intimidating for somebody stepping in. And if you want to get into those challenges, I'd be happy to address that as well. But
yeah, well, where were some of the challenges you faced?
Yeah, so
you did international.
We did
adoption,
two different.
right?
Yeah, we did 2 different. So our daughters are adopted internationally from Ethiopia. So that was an international private adoption. And then our son is adopted through the foster system here. He's from Long Beach, California. And yeah, with the international adoption, I mean, there's a lot of red tape, kind of a lot of bureaucracy. You have to navigate lots of processes whenever you're dealing with international anything, honestly,
Immigration.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Definitely have probably talked about that on the show before too. Yeah, there's all sorts of challenges there. There's a significant cost involved, although strangely not as significant as domestic private adoption. It's more expensive to adopt domestically and internationally usually.
Wow.
There's a big time frame involved. I mean, it often will take several years to adopt a child internationally. I had some friends who adopted from China, and I think it took like 5 years. So, I mean, imagine that. Imagine you're going to adopt a baby, and after 5 years of waiting and trying, you end up with a 5-year-old.
He's a little kid.
Yeah, he's grown up. Yeah.
Wow.
So there's unique challenges there. Beyond that, I mean, I think with the foster system, it's a whole different ballgame. I mean, honestly, the waiting thing wasn't a thing. Like, we got certified for us. We got certified on a Monday, and on a Tuesday, we got a phone call that there was a little one in need of a home. Got that phone call at noon. He was in our house by 3:00. So there was like no waiting. It was just like this really jarring experience. But that's come with its own challenges. I mean, with international adoption, one of the things that this is neither a challenge nor a strength, but it was a little bit cleaner. You adopted the kids. By the time you picked them up, they were yours, like legally. You bring them home, and that's that. Whereas with foster system, when they come to your home, they're not legally yours. They're legally somebody else's, or legally, kind of ward of the state. And so then you spend months, years going through this crazy, like really difficult legal process, and your heart is ripped wide open by the like, because you're like, when you foster someone, you're thrust right into the depth of their own trauma. You meet this kid at their lowest moment, and that doesn't just go away. Like, you don't get in a plane and fly to another country. You like live in it with them, and it's crazy difficult. There's all sorts of legal challenges. There's practical challenges of having social worker in and out of your house every week. Like, so it's every way you go about adoption is both the most difficult thing and the most beautiful thing that we've ever experienced, no matter how you go about it. So,
yeah, wow, that's amazing, man. I mean, I'm thinking right now, like, there's maybe, I don't know if this is kind of silly, right? But have you ever seen like movies of people adopting, and then there's a little bit of this stigma, like, what if the kids turn out, they have a DNA that's bad, or things like that, and there's a stigma. So what would you say are some of the, or creates drama and things like that? Have you experienced, like, was that real for you, or do you think, like, man, it kind of depends, or is that just like a fake scenario?
No. No, that's a total thing. Like, you never know. The first thing to say is you never know what you're going to get, no matter how you go about parenting. Like, even if you go about it biologically, you're never really sure what's going to come out, right?
Yes.
Parenting is, we like to be in control, and there's nothing about parenting that's in our control.
Oh, yeah.
Wow. That said, though, like, there is at least in the case of biological parenting, most of the problems you encounter are of your own making. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you're the one that screwed up the kid. You know what I mean? Like, they're coming to you, and their challenges in life, the person they're going to talk to about their with their therapist someday is you. Like, or, whereas when you adopt, sometimes you're inheriting stuff that other people have done. You're inheriting generational curses, maybe from another family. You're inheriting words that have been spoken or actions that have been done by someone else. There's a saying in the adoption community that these are kids from hard places. And when you have a child biologically, there's no backstory. The backstory is, fell in love with my wife and we had a kid, and now here's the kid. But when you adopt a child, you're inheriting a backstory. And a lot of times they wouldn't be adoptable if the backstory wasn't hard. And so the backstory often comes with trauma. I think of our son who,
wow.
There are ways of scoring trauma, like of like grading the level of trauma. And, you can ask questions like, have you ever, seen violence in your home? Have you ever been hurt by someone who's supposed to love you? Like, all this sort of stuff. And I remember my wife and I took a class once where we were supposed to like grade our own levels of trauma in life. And I went through this sheet. It was like, put a 1 next to every one of these that applies to you. And I got to the end of it and I had a 0. Like, I'm the least traumatized person in the history of the world. Like, I had,
You're a happy boy.
I know. I had parents that's,
Wow.
that cared for me and took care of me and all that. Like, I'm grateful.
Wow. Yay for your parents.
Yeah, right? I'm kind of soft, but I'm grateful, But then we did it for our son, and he, at the time, was 2 years old and had an 8. 8 of like 15 things he'd experienced at 2 years old.
Wow.
And so, yeah, you come with hard stuff, and that can't help but shape somebody's personality and somebody's response to life. Now, that said, I do believe with all of my being that love is greater than trauma, and that love is greater than, well, anything. I mean, Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians is one of the only things that last, faith, hope, and love. The greatest of the one of the only things that last, right? The greatest of these is love. And at the end of the day, we haven't yet encountered something with any of our kids that the answer to dealing with the difficult situation wasn't just love them and they're going to be okay and you're going to be okay. Now, I know that's an oversimplification. I know people go through, like adoptive parents go through really hard stuff. But man, at the end of the day, they're kids. They're kids and they need safety, they need comfort, they need protection, they need boundaries, they need all the stuff that parents provide. And in my experience, that stuff tends to be a lot stronger. Now, could there be a case where a kid's coming in with a significant emotional impairment or significant, trauma that leads to all sorts of yeah, for sure. I mean, that hasn't been our experience. We haven't had that kind of like crazy level, so I don't want to just dismiss anybody else's experience. But man, I just don't think that should be a reason to keep you out of it, Like the fear of the unknown shouldn't be really a reason that we don't do anything in life, And when you have on one hand, I mean, let's consider the factors. On one hand, you have God telling his people, I want you to care for my kids. And on the other hand, you have fear of the unknown and what could possibly be. And I just kind of put those in both hands and say, like, weigh it out. Which one's more important? It's obvious every time. Do what God tells you to do and trust him. And that's, last thing I'll say, I'm rambling on this one, but like, one thing we've learned through the adoption process or through life process is if God calls you to something, it's just your responsibility to show up and be faithful to what he's called you to. It's his responsibility to provide the power that you need. So that was at every point of the adoption journey, we would routinely tell God when we felt in over our heads, when we felt stressed out, we felt like we couldn't go on. It was like, you know what? You called us to this. You need to show up. And we just put the responsibility back on him, over and over again. It's like, you called us to this. We're here, but we don't have what it takes. We need you.
Wow.
And I think you can do that. I think you can do that with anything God called you to. But for people who feel called to adoption, I just always tell them, he called you, but he's the one that's going to provide the power.
So how long have you been a parent for?
Yeah. So our daughter's 14 years. They're biological sisters from Ethiopia. We adopted them. We got them on Christmas Day of 2007. So we're coming up on 14 years next week.
Wow.
And then with our son, we got him on 3 days before Christmas, December 22nd of 2015. So we're coming up on 6 years with him. Yeah, just in a couple days. Yeah.
So in these many years, I can only imagine, but what have been some of like the biggest rewards when you think about your kids?
Yeah. Honestly, the same as any parent would say. Sorry, I'm crunching ice in the microphone. That's probably bad form, isn't it?
What?
I'm crunching ice in the microphone. That's probably bad form.
I didn't hear it.
Oh, good. All right. Then never mind. Pretend like I didn't say anything.
Yeah.
The same things with any parent. The pride of watching them become who they're going to be. My daughter's in college right now, 18 years old. She thinks she's an adult. In some ways she is.
Yeah.
But it's cool. It's cool seeing
That's
who she's
so
become.
good.
Like it's cool seeing what she loves, and it's cool seeing myself and my wife reflected in her personality. At the same time, seeing the unique person that she is, and just the joy of parenting is the joy of parenting, which is why I look at, people who are worried about it being some like second best experience, or, one thing that I didn't address but kind of alluded to is that some parents feel like they might like, well, I love them the same as I would a biological child. And I'm like, yeah, unless there's something really messed up somewhere, of course you will. Like they're your kids. That's why if you talk about stigmas or faux pas, things you shouldn't do with adoptive parents. I've done it before, but when you use language like your own kids, people will say, could you not have your own kids? Or when are you going to have your own kids? And I'm like, these are my kids. These are my own kids. If you're trying to draw a distinction between them and biological, just say, could you not have biological kids?
Yeah.
But my own kids, these are mine. Like I love them as much as I would love anybody, as much as I can love anybody. And so, I feel the rewards of adopting in some ways are the same as the rewards of parenting with of just any kind of parenting, with one caveat, which I would say is, I think, and this might sound a little bit cocky, but I think my wife and I, as a result of our adoption journey, have a little bit of, how do I say this, like a special insight into the gospel. I think all parents, if they're paying attention, have special insight into the gospel by parenting. Like
wow.
you see in your kids, like the love you have for them is the love your father has for you. The ways that they behave toward you are the ways you behave toward him. Like any parent can learn a lot, but like adoption is a massive metaphor in the New Testament for what God has done for us, how he's brought us into his family. And I think I'll always say, like, because of our adoption journey, the gospel lives in our house. Like every day we wake up, we're confronted by these beautiful little faces that that show us what God has done for us. And I think that's just such a unexpected reward of this journey. Is that every time I tell him I love him, I just feel him saying the same thing to me, you know?
Wow.
Yeah.
Love it, man. I feel like I can relate when you talk about, well, you were mentioning Ezekiel and some other Jeremiah, right? And you were mentioning how God's heart is for the vulnerable, the immigrant, the orphan, and the widow, right? You mentioned like those four specifically. And I mean, in a sense, when you were saying, you know, I feel like I have like a extra insight into the gospel. Something about that I feel like it's true even in my life when it comes to, I'm an immigrant, right? So I mean, I decided to come here, but having lived in the U.S. for 16 years, maybe 17, I can't even remember.
How do you look this good at 40 years old? That's ridiculous.
Not a lot of coffee, man. Gotta quit on coffee. Not true. More coffee, more caffeine.
Okay.
Yeah. So now you're confused.
I am super confused.
Now we don't know. I'm 40, so it's been a few years since I've been here in the U.S. And the stories I've heard, again, not so much my story. I feel like my story is almost like the easier of the immigrant stories when it comes to living in America. Like, yes, I had a few struggles here and there, but from what I've heard from other people, it's like, wow, all of that to be in the U.S.
Yeah.
Right? And I can't even believe it. And then there's all kinds of immigrants, right? But really, I feel like people don't leave their countries for a simple reason.
Totally.
Right? I mean, there's things going on that make people go all the way to say, you know what, I'm going to cross countries to knock on the doors of this other place.
At great personal cost, risk, totally.
Even if the answer might be, I don't want you here, right? They're willing to risk.
Wow.
So, I mean, that says a lot about the heart of God and the gospel. And
it does. And the truth is, like, you know, we're all kind of headed toward this heavenly Jerusalem, you know, this restored kingdom of God on earth. And when we arrive there, we all arrive as immigrants, don't we? Like, we don't arrive as citizens. We arrive as immigrants, and then God makes us citizens, which is crazy. We come to the gateway of the kingdom as outcasts, as outsiders, and He brings us in. So same image, man. Yeah.
So what you're saying is, so I picture the world, and let's take out borders and countries and nationalities.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And what you have is people.
Yes.
In a world, and then some of these people have experienced, you know, a way different life than us because of maybe organized communities look different in different countries.
Yep.
Right? And to say that is the heart of God, like, what if this is, I mean, I was even talking about this in another episode, but what is earth? What is life?
Yeah.
If it's not about caring for one another. So it circles back all the way to your friend saying, you know, something about, you mentioned like relationships, like something like
the meaning of life is relationships.
Meaning of life is relationships.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it, man. Like, I mean, at the end of the day, people ask Jesus over and over again, what's most important? And he says, love God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbors yourself, you know? And when he's asked in the story of through the story of the, why is it escaping me right now? The Good Samaritan, who's your neighbor, he comes up with the most extreme case possible.
Yes.
You know, like the guy that's farthest away from you and everybody in between. So he basically expands your neighborhood to the whole world, you know, and says your neighbor is, you know?
Yeah. And what I love too, I mean, just kind of like vamping on that story a little bit, is that when I hear it, it seems like we're always asking almost like the wrong questions when it comes to God and Jesus, right? And just life in general. And then it's almost like Jesus flips the question. It's like, you're asking, who is your neighbor? But it's almost like Jesus says, who are you neighbor to?
100%. Yeah. Because that's what he asks at the end of the parable, right? He says, now, which one was a neighbor to the man?
Yes.
So he flips it. He flips it onto the person who's asking the question and says, who will you, as you said, who will you be neighborly toward?
Okay. So to end, my last question about adoption, what would be like the question that we need to flip? Like when people are going to Google and looking up, how do I adopt or how much is going to cost? Are those the helpful questions, or is there a better question we can be asking when it comes to this?
Those are helpful, but they're secondary for sure. The question that, in my opinion, we ought to ask, not just what's interesting is if you're Googling that other stuff, chances are you've already asked the first question, which is, what does God think about orphans? That's where we start. You know what I mean? And that's what in our story, that was the guy challenged me. Think about this, or we spent some time in Mozambique in East Africa and saw this is what orphanhood means. And then you asked about stats earlier. Then you start to look at, so what really got us was we read the Bible, see what the Bible says. We have these experiences personally, and then those experiences make sense of the stats that you start to read. And you start to see things like globally, these numbers are all really hard to wrap your head around, but globally there's 150 million orphans in the world, which is huge. It's a massive issue, right? Until you start to look at the numbers of Christians, and you see that globally there are 2.5 billion people who would say that they're Christians. So you see that
wow.
So you see that Christians outnumber orphans 20-1. You look in the U.S. and the numbers are even more staggering. It's really hard to know exactly. Again, numbers are hard to wrap your head around in this kind of a context, but let's say I've heard one person say there are 100,000 unattached orphans in the U.S., which means no father or mother, that are essentially adoptable right now, waiting in the foster system, many of them aging out of the foster system because nobody adopts them. 100,000. Again, big number, until you realize that there are over 300,000 churches in the U.S., not Christians, churches. 300,000 churches, which means that if every third church, not every third Christian, but every third church took in one, there'd be no more unattached orphans in the U.S. And so you look at it and you just say, I think the question we have to be asking first and foremost as Christians is, what does God think about this? Not what are the challenges, not what are the costs, not what are, but
wow.
What does God think? Because like I said, if you put that in one hand, that is always more important. And then if what he thinks is, I care about this, and you as my people need to care about this, then like I said, he's got to provide all the stuff. He's got to deal with the costs. He's got to deal with the, you just show up. You just say, okay, my God, my Father cares about this. My King cares about this. So I have to as well. Wow. And then you can Google all the other stuff. How much does it cost? How much,
How much does it cost?
Well, it depends. It depends. It's if you're going through the foster system.
If they're going to college.
Yeah, well, you're talking about the long-term cost? It costs your life. That's the
that's
truth.
So good.
It's just like parenting, right?
Yeah.
It's funny. I was thinking about raising my kids, and obviously there was an upfront cost of the adoption, but then of course you feed them and you clothe them and you pay for their AYSO soccer and on and on. And then my daughter moved off to college, and I just realized this year that I'm still paying for her. I'm paying for college. We're paying for this and that, and then she's going to get married, and we're going to pay for that. And it's no, really, parenting and adoption is no different than then. Parenting is giving your life. It's not giving a year or 2 years, or
wow.
It's giving your life, and that's again back to the gospel, right? That's what Jesus does. That's what Jesus does. He gives his life.
Love it. All right, man. So this is what we're gonna do right now. Is we're gonna end the episode with the emoji reaction to adoption.
Okay.
So we're gonna go through 5 seasons of belief. It's gonna be strange because I'm trying this, but
all right.
So we're gonna go from blasphemous to divine. Okay. So when it comes to this idea of adoption or the heart of God and adoption, what would be the worst idea, the most blasphemous, the one that's further away from God?
I think apathy. I think just turn around and walk away. That's what remember. I quoted Sodom and Gomorrah. I quoted Ezekiel about Sodom. What was the sin of your sister Sodom? She was arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned.
Wow.
In other words, just paid attention to herself.
Yeah.
And that's so. I think the blasphemous, the I don't know if that's the word I would use, but the way wrong thing to do would be to hear the heart of God, to read the Bible, and to walk away and say,
Wow, man, so good. Okay, what is the most skeptical idea or the most skeptical thing about adopting?
I actually don't mind skeptical. Skeptical means you're asking good questions. And so there might be someone listening to this that'll have all sorts of questions, whether they're theological questions or practical questions. And it's, and because there are practical questions to consider. There are all sorts of things. Like, I mean, one big one is like, maybe there's somebody listening to this today who is feeling moved to adoption, but they're married to someone who's not. Like, how do you deal with that? That's a real question.
That's good.
Maybe there's somebody who's single who's listening to this and saying, how do I step into adoption? Or what is, so they're, I don't mind skeptical. I think skeptical is good. Because if skeptical means you're asking questions. If skeptical means that you just want to ignore it, well, then you're
it goes to blasphemous.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it depends on where you're leaning. Skeptical is good if you're leaning in.
Love it. So as we lean in, the next one would be inspired. So what's something inspirational about adoption?
I mean, I think if you're feeling inspired, that's what started for me. If you're feeling inspired, then I would challenge you with the same thing my friend asked. If you hear some of this and you think, wow, this is the first I've heard, or this really makes sense to me, then read the Bible. I mean, the Bible is the inspired word of God, right? So read the Bible with an eye for the vulnerable, with the eye for the fatherless, and see if like your heart doesn't change as you begin to read the inspired word of God.
Love it.
Yeah.
Love it. Okay. So the next one would be holy.
Yeah.
What's holy about adoption?
Like I said, I think just, I mean, God says to his people, he calls himself throughout the Bible, and they call him the Holy One of Israel, And then in different places, he says, you're to be holy like I'm holy. And I think what I would say about that is, like I said earlier, caring for the fatherless is God's priority. It's one of his values that he puts his name on. This is who I am. I am a father to the fatherless. And he expects his people to be the same. Be holy as he's holy. Be compassionate as he's compassionate. Be just as he's just. Be a father to the fatherless as he is.
Love it.
Yeah.
Love it, man. So good. And finally, divine.
Yeah.
What's the most divine? I mean, and we kind of elaborated as we talked about this, but if you summarize, what's the most divine idea about adoption?
Well, you'll know the love of God more. Like, I don't know how else to say it, but if you adopt a child, the gospel will come to live in your house, and you will daily be reminded of how much your Father loves you.
Oof. So good, man.
Yeah.
So good. Hey, my friends, this is Beto Gudiño, El Comunicador. Say it with me, El Comunicador. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it was helpful. I invite you to check out christianpodcast.com. Check out our emoji reactions and let us know, what's your reaction to this episode? How would you rate it with an emoji? And what are maybe your questions about adoption that you want to ask? If you find this helpful, maybe reach out to us. Go to our website. Josh, do you have a place where you want to point people to, maybe if they thinking about adoption?
Oh man, I mean, easiest thing for me would be just talk to me.
Honestly, so good. How do I get a hold of you?
Find me on our website is canopy.church. Just shoot an email to me through that. I'd be happy to chat with anybody who wants to talk about it. Whether you're local here, we'll go grab coffee or something. If you're not local, get a phone call in the books or something like that. But beyond that, I mean, there's some great resources that I know I've come across. I just can't think of them at the moment. But just reach out. I'd love to chat.
Love it. Thank you so much for your time, Josh.
Thanks, man. Good to be with you.